Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Liam O'Rourke, and I'm a Kevin B. Harrington Student Ambassador. On behalf of the faculty, staff, and students of the New Hampshire Institute of Politics at St. Anthony College, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us this afternoon at this event. The Institute's mission is to educate, engage, and empower citizens of all ages to actively participate in the civic and political life of their communities and strengthen democracy. The institution is nonpartisan and does not endorse political issues or candidates. Before we begin this afternoon's program, I would like to remind you to turn off any cell phones or any other devices that make sounds. Today's speaker, Elizabeth Rickenbach, is an assistant professor in the psychology department here at St. Anthony College. She is interested in the study of health and well-being in the daily lives of middle-aged and older adults. She is particularly interested in the examination of risk factors, as in stress and sleep disruptions, related to cognitive decline and how individuals and their families cope with changes in cognitive function. This afternoon, Professor Rickenbach will be joining the Institute to present a talk entitled Brain Training Programs in the Marketplace for Memory, as part of the Faculty Research Colloquium series. She will examine the area of brain training as a method of fighting cognitive decline, how this method has entered the marketplace, and questions surrounding how effective these marketplace brain training programs may truly be. Following her remarks, there will be a brief question and answer period. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Elizabeth.
Thank you all for coming. I know there's a lot of things that happen on campus. Still the 12:30 hours, even though we don't have class. So thank you for coming. I appreciate it. I see some familiar faces from my classes, so welcome. As you mentioned, my name is Beth Rickenbach, and I'm in the psychology department. I have a background in aging studies that I think is informative and helpful for how I do my research and the perspective I take when doing research. And that is a Ph.D. in aging studies, which involves a policy, psychological, and biological perspectives on aging. So I think the talk today kind of truly represents that interdisciplinary perspective. And so that's why I think I have relevance as a person from the psychology department here at NHIOP. So thank you for having me. The research that I'm presenting is, as Liam mentioned, is on brain training and its role in the marketplace. And so I want to kind of briefly talk about the efficacy of it and then present some research that I did related to that. A couple points before I begin. The research on brain training in psychology and aging is pretty contentious. And so as a junior scholar, I decided I should join that conversation. People have a lot of strong feelings about whether it works or not. And so I'm here to kind of objectively look at that research, and also point out that when I was in graduate school, my first year of grad school, I worked in one of the labs of one of the researchers who does brain training research. I'll present some of her research today. So I'm familiar with working on it a little bit from that perspective as well. I did this as part of work I do as a visiting scientist at Brandeis University, while also teaching here. Okay, so I'd like to test this to see if it works. And it does. I'd like to thank my colleagues, my co-authors on this project, Matthew Hughes, and Margie Lockman, and also the funding that supported the data collection efforts for this, which is from the National Institute on Aging. This is research that is in its final rounds of revision that will be submitted soon for publication. Okay, so just to give kind of setting the stage for how brain training entered the market, I want to give kind of a little bit of a background on where we are and why people are excited about brain training. So we know that the population is aging. That's not news. And you can see from 1950, which is what this shows, the number and the proportion of older adults in the population, to 2050, it is expected that this is the number and proportion of older adults in the population, so people over age 65. So I don't present this as a fear tactic because I think there's some assumptions that come with, like, oh my gosh, the population's aging, we should be nervous about this. And we shouldn't. Not all of those assumptions are true, right? That older adults are dependent and that we're going to need to take care of them. Because those of you who are in my adulthood and aging class or have taken it know that we're going to talk about it, or we have talked about that that's just not true. Many older adults are grandparents or working or playing mentorship roles within their communities. And So it is important to note that there is a greater proportion of older adults in society, but to kind of take that nuanced perspective that all of the kind of fear and assumptions that might accompany that are not necessarily true. You can also see here that the younger population is also increasing. There's just more people. So there's more people, younger people working and contributing to Social Security and the policies that support older adults after they retire. So we're just getting larger as a population, but there is a greater number of older adults. We've gone from around 8% to 20%. So what does that mean? Well, that does mean that there are some changes that happen with aging that might have implications for our society. Some normal changes in cognition, which I'll talk about in a moment, but also sensory changes, mobility changes, the way we use healthcare, the experience of chronic conditions. Those have implications for how we will use healthcare services and how we will navigate in our societies. So that's kind of the context from a demography perspective in terms of the population for a little bit of where brain training comes from. But we also know that in addition to older adults maybe experiencing mobility changes, cognition changes, etc., that they're also pretty resilient and pretty good at using compensatory strategies to compensate for losses that they might experience. And so many older adults have high levels of life satisfaction and live independently in the community, right? And they seek that ability to be resilient. Okay. The other policy implications are, of course, that implications for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and then the millions of dollars that are spent on grant funding for research that supports brain training research. Okay, so as I mentioned, cognitive aging is one of the changes that happens as part of the aging process. It's normal to experience declines in memory. I'm starting to experience them now, according to research. In your 30s is when it begins, so I'm already, on a subtle decline. But these are not changes that people might be aware of explicitly in their lives. But some of the normative changes that happens with cognition are memory, speed of processing, and reasoning. So those are some normal things that decline. There's wide individual variation in how that happens. Of course, there's a lot of factors that could influence the extent and the rate and to what extent our memory or speed of processing or reasoning declines. Other things remain pretty stable or even improve, like vocabulary. I forget I have this. All right. So those are some normal changes with cognitive aging. There's also non-normal changes, right? All of you know about Alzheimer's disease. That is a non-normal change. It's not normal to get Alzheimer's disease. 1 in 9 people over age 65 have Alzheimer's disease, so it is increasingly common as we age. 1 in 9 is still a scary number, probably, but it's not the normative thing that happens. And there are currently 5 FDA-approved drugs to treat the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, and that's important. It's the symptoms, it's not the underlying cause. We're still working on that, and we have some work to do in that area. So we have an aging population. We have some drugs that work to treat some of the symptoms, so cognitive, behavioral, sleep symptoms associated with Alzheimer's disease, and maybe give people a couple extra good years. Improve their quality of life, give them some extra good years that they would normally have. Slow the trajectory of their decline, of their memory decline. So that's where we are in terms of the state of treatments or prevention for Alzheimer's disease. We don't yet know how to reverse any of the pathology that happens in the brain that causes the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. And to make it even more complicated, the pathology that happens in the brains of people with Alzheimer's disease also happens in the brains of people who don't ever get Alzheimer's disease. So it can be tricky to try to understand when people have it and how can we treat it. Okay, so you might have seen in the news that recently, this is in, I believe, November of 2016, Eli Lilly had a failed, a major drug company had a failed clinical trial trying to find something that would break down the pathology in the brain. So amyloid plaques in the brain are one of the characteristic pathology associated with Alzheimer's disease. And this drug that failed was an antibody, was training the antibodies in the brain to attack the amyloid protein before it built into plaques. So at an earlier stage, preventing the plaques from forming. So trying in a more aggressive way to slow the decline of Alzheimer's. And that drug trial failed. So there was a lot of money and time and energy and investment in that drug trial. What does that mean for the failing of that drug trial? It could mean a couple things. It could mean that the nature of the way that the antibodies were attacking the amyloid beta wasn't targeting amyloid plaques in the right way. Or it could mean that our hypothesis that amyloid plaques, which is that characteristic pathology associated with Alzheimer's, is maybe not the underlying cause of why people get Alzheimer's, especially when we also know people without Alzheimer's also have the same aging pathology. So that's not what we're debating today, because I'm not a neuroscientist. But I want to give you that background because it's important for the state of science in Alzheimer's disease to think about how brain training came about and why it's so popular. So Eli Lilly's failed drug trial raises questions and concerns within the field about this theory of the amyloid cascade hypothesis, that amyloid is kind of the underlying pathology related to Alzheimer's. So the Nature journal released an article shortly after saying that actually, no, we think that is still important, this theory of amyloid plaques being an underlying, the characteristic pathology associated with Alzheimer's. But maybe it wasn't targeting in the right way. Maybe we did start earlier. So the next phase of their work is actually going to be targeting people not who have mild dementia taking the drug, but rather people before they have dementia who are at risk, who have the pathology in their brain but aren't showing symptoms. So maybe just earlier on. So that's where we are. We have some work to do, really, is kind of the take-home message in terms of Alzheimer's prevention and treatment. All right. So we have an aging population, we have normal memory loss that happens. It's kind of confusing and unclear when it happens and how it happens and what it means. And we have a lack of Alzheimer's treatments. And for many midlife older adults, research shows that one of their top fears is potential memory loss. So that really, wow, what a market for brain training, right? So, and I'm really trying to objectively look at brain training, but really it's important to kind of set the stage with where we are in the aging field. So brain training, I'll review a little bit of the literature, but I want to give kind of some background on the many different perspectives on brain training from psychologists and gerontologists. And there's been 30, 40 years of brain training work, perhaps more depending on maybe how you define brain training. And it could be cognitive exercises or brain training or cognitive training. All those words are kind of used interchangeably. Sometimes they're done on the computer. They vary in format or length or type or the domain of cognition that's targeted. So as I said, memory, speed of processing, and reasoning are some of the top areas of cognition that decline. With aging, those are some of the top areas that are targeted with the brain training programs. So we had decades of research on brain training, and that led us to, in 2014, a statement from 70-plus scientists at Stanford, led by scientists at Stanford and the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin. And they released a statement really cautioning the increasing role of brain training in the workplace. So this was a consensus statement by scientists from all over the world. And really some of their major points in this letter was that, number one, the effects are potentially overstated in some of the research and the way the research has been presented in popular media. We know that physical exercise is good. There's a lot of research that shows physical exercise is good. So to what extent should we be promoting cognitive training when we have a lot of really good sound evidence for the benefits of physical exercise and strength training for our brain? And some of the other concerns were related to design flaws. Those of you in my research methods and cognition and development class, we talked about that in class this afternoon, right? So correlational studies, a lack of a control group in a good control condition, anecdotal evidence, the lumosity that you guys might hear all the advertisements for on the radio. The people in those advertisements are often given iPads and things as gifts for their testimonies on their experience with lumosity. So certainly there are some ethical considerations to that. They also suggest, if you remember the picture I had at the beginning of the person with like an iPad in front of their face, they also make the point that what is the trade-off of 1 hour spent in front of a computer with an iPad or doing some sort of brain training versus 1 hour spent hiking or with your grandchildren, So how should we be allocating our time, and is that the best use of our time? Will it hurt you? Probably not, but it's just a consideration of how we can make it part of our life and the other things we do in our life. So that's some of their concerns. They suggest the need for more research. Okay, and then there was a response. So this is over 100 scientists, also scientists, one of them my professor in grad school. And so I really had to like be kind of careful about entering this conversation and really being objective about it. And so know that I am, because she's somebody that I really respect. And these are all good scientists. So they responded now to the original letter. And they've said, science is real. Facts are real. Facts are not alternative facts. We all support that facts are real things, and that this research should be evidence-based. So they agreed there. And they made some points about what they think research and brain training should do, that it should be demonstrating that tasks that we do, so games we play on the computer, I've got an example in a moment, demonstrate real abilities. So like when I do something on the computer, when I remember how many blocks I see or where the blocks are, does that relate to my underlying ability in memory or speed of processing? So that's one thing the research should do, they say. And they say that some of their research has provided evidence of that. And also, the effects should last over time. So when I do a brain training exercise, it should carry over beyond when I finish it. And research looking at brain training should, and they say we need more of, should look at the role of motivations and expectations. And that's what my research that I'm presenting does. So what is the role that our motivations and our expectations and how we experience brain training, how does that affect our reaction to it or our perception of it? So that's what I'm working on in my contribution to this conversation. Okay, so then how did these groups, so if we go back, how did 70 plus scientists and 100 plus scientists come to different kind of conclusions that yes, there is some evidence that it works, and these people saying no, it doesn't really work? How did they come to kind of different conclusions? After this was released in 2016, this is gerontology drama. This is fun gerontology drama that you guys are getting background on, right? In 2016, the Association for Psychological Science released a 84-page report on summarizing this literature with one goal. And what they claim is that maybe the goal of what the prior people were trying to do was not the same. And their goal is trying to understand how brain training helps you on other things. So brain training can't just help you on brain training. It has to help you in other places, in other ways in your life. It has to help you like get your groceries and find your car in the parking lot and manage your finances. And so that's the perspective with which they reviewed that literature. And they found that when you do brain training, you're really good at brain training, right? So when tasks become more distant to the thing that you did, there is less evidence that it helps, right? So there is some that has shown stronger evidence than others. One of which was the one I was involved with, which is brainhq.com or Posit Science. It has the most evidence, but many do not. Many have no evidence, or are just commercially available on iPhones, iPads, video games without any research associated with them at all. And as a consumer, it might be hard to sort through and know which ones are evidence-based or not. And especially as a consumer who's maybe an older adult who's on a fixed income and has limited resources to pay for some of these services, some of which cost hundreds of dollars. So it's just about being maybe a smart consumer and how to help people be smart consumers rather than is it bad or is it good. So that's what they were beginning to start the conversation on, and they provide some really good policy recommendations for how, and scientific recommendations for specifically like how should this research be conducted, and should there be a control group, and this is what the control group should look like. So they provide really clear recommendations on how research should happen in this field. Okay, so then, of course, it's not over. Then in 2016, the professor that I was my graduate professor in one of my programs, in the first year of my program, she presented at the International Alzheimer's Association meeting that her research, which has not been published, so not been peer-reviewed and published yet, but it was presented at the conference, that 10 hours of speed of processing training, which I'll show you in a moment, is related to a 50% reduction in risk of Alzheimer's over 10 years. Which in that case, you guys should just leave right now and go do that instead of listen to me. And that's amazing. So that we were kind of yet to be seen. But this conversation is on. So that's the posit science, which is the most well validated of the programs. So the specific training that she found to be related to reduced dementia risk is this program, which I did. I administered this as a graduate student. This is a much fancier version of it than was available when I was working on it. But essentially, you're asked to do two things. You're asked to identify what you see in the middle. So you're looking at this background, and images flash onto the screen and then disappear. And the images are these car or truck, and then these images around the outside. The cows stay. And you're asked, what did you see in the middle? Did you see a car or a truck? And where on the outside did you see an image? So what and where? And it gets harder. It gets harder because the car and the truck look more similar, and it gets harder because the things in the background look more similar to the images that pop up. And if there's any questions throughout, feel free to ask. I don't think I said that. Yeah?
Is this similar to like a pattern recognition?
So what they're targeting here is just how quickly can you answer the question and do you remember where it was, right? So it's a memory and speed of processing is really what they're targeting. Yeah, the time is important, so it's the reaction time as well. And then there's points taken off for errors, so timing and accuracy. But yeah, pattern recognition, there's some memory tests that they've also done memory and reasoning in the posit science also has memory and reasoning tests, but consistently the speed of processing on this task is the one that demonstrates effects for driving, reduced accidents, and then now they're saying dementia too. Okay, other questions? So, there are others that have less evidence, and one of them is Lumosity, which in 2015 or 2014 was sued for $50 million by the Federal Trade Commission and then paid a settlement of $2 million for false advertising for suggesting that their program prevented dementia. And others in the field, I have this in quotations because it's a phrase that a man named Peter Whitehouse has coined. The marketplace of memory might have been developed due to fears about memory loss and no available treatments for the extreme form of memory loss that is not the normative that we're all going to experience, but that can happen to some people. And so he deems this the marketplace of memory that we've kind of capitalized on this fear potentially. And he holds a lot of kind of extreme views of aging, one of which being that Alzheimer's in general is a myth and that it's just kind of an exaggerated form of aging. So I'm not endorsing all of his views, but this is a phrase that he uses. So, okay, question. So the current setting. So one of the goals of the scientists critiquing brain training research was to understand what are the role of motivations and expectations for how we experience brain training, and that's what we did. So we didn't have brain training in our program, but we used the language that people use to describe brain training. So we wanted to examine what is the susceptibility to brain training, and we used an experimental study, and it was a within person's daily diary study. So people first completed a background interview where we did a more extensive cognitive test and we asked just background information about the individuals. And then over 7 days, they completed cognitive tasks, brief cognitive tasks, which we'll describe in a moment, and then they self-reported about their cognition. And there was 2 conditions. So people were randomized to one of 2 conditions where they received language similar to brain training, which I'll read. So this is the brain training simulation language. This is a brain training exercise. This kind of brain exercise can make you more mentally fit and improve your memory. It can sharpen your mind and improve your brain health. We want to see how much you can improve your memory by doing this exercise. So that might sound similar to like the things you hear on the radio advertising. That's what our goal was. And then in the other condition, the control condition, we said this is a memory task. This kind of task is a good indicator of your memory. It can show you how well you remember things. It can provide evidence of your memory and demonstrate your recall skills. We want to see how much you can remember in this test. So that's more standard to what might happen in a lab setting, and it might even be invoking some stereotypes, which I'll get to. Okay, so our hypotheses were, we had this memory improvement condition at the top, right? So we wanted to see, does brain training make people feel better about their memory? That's what we thought would happen. We didn't think their actual memory would improve because it was a basic kind of cognitive task. Other than maybe a practice effect, we didn't think that would be better. Then the memory task condition we thought might actually worsen their subjective cognition and might actually, because of that, then decrease their objective cognition, their actual cognition, their performance on the cognitive tasks versus their self. And then we also looked at whether, which is another gap in the field, are certain people more susceptible to brain training? Older adults, middle-aged adults, different education levels, differences in how people perceive their control over their cognition. So some of the rationale that informed those hypotheses. So our first hypothesis was that we thought when we tell people they can improve their memory that they're going to think they did. So one of the rationale that we thought might explain that hypothesis was demand characteristics. So if people sign up for a study in which we say this kind of thing can improve your memory, people might think that they should report that it does improve their memory as they complete the study. They're meeting the demands of the study. A second concept from psychology that informed us for how we think people might behave in the study is cognitive dissonance. If people are investing time and in their own case money in other settings, not in ours, we didn't make them pay, to complete a cognitive task each day, they might want their beliefs to kind of align with the time they spent on that, and therefore they might think that, yes, their memory has improved. Okay, so we also thought that when we tell people this is a memory task, we want to see how good your memory is, that was the control condition, that maybe their self-reports will get worse. So in the psychological literature, there's a long line of research that's documented when we activate stereotypes in people, they might perform to those stereotypes, and namely in race and gender, but also in aging, particularly stereotypes about memory or driving. So people, if we activate stereotypes about their age, we tell them this is a memory test, I'm going to test your memory, I'm going to see how good you are, we might activate or worsen their performance and their beliefs about their performance and also their actual performance. Okay, and then finally, self-efficacy research in the psychological literacy informed our hypothesis that we thought people who have better perceptions about their control over their memory would self-report better memory. If you think you can improve your memory, you're going to say you improved your memory. It's really what we were thinking. Right? Okay. So we had 145 people recruited from the greater Boston area. There was a wide age range. So we also looked at separated by younger, middle-aged, and older adults. And on average, there's 15 years of education and 60% female. So this is a really wordy slide, so I apologize. But the materials that we used were, besides demographics, we also measured their perceived control over their cognition, which is scale. These are a couple example items. This is just how much do you think you can improve your memory. This is a characteristic that we expected to be staple in people, kind of like a personality characteristic about just how much in general do they think they can get better in their memory. And then we measured objective cognition with a 10-item immediate recall task. So we told them 10 words, and then we asked them to recall those words back to us. And then a 60-second category fluency task, which was asking people to name all of the things that they can in a category, such as animals or furniture. And we varied those each day, so it wasn't the same category each day. And the recall task was a different list each day as well. Okay, and then we asked people a couple questions about their memory each day. How good is your memory today? How much do you think you can improve your memory? And compared to yesterday, how much do you think your memory has improved? Okay, so fun part. We did multi-level modeling with SAS, version 9.4, where we predicted these are the two outcome variables, daily subjective cognition and objective cognition. And this type of modeling allows us to simultaneously look at the within-person things each day and the between-person things, so gender, at the same time. And if somebody missed a day, we could incorporate all that data. Okay. So what we found is a big, pretty table, but I've kind of highlighted the really groundbreaking finding that we found here, which is not groundbreaking, but age and education were both related to cognition. So this was our finding of predicting what was related to objective cognition. We didn't think it would change, and we found that. That was supported. And in the control group, we actually thought it would get worse. That wasn't supported. We didn't find any change for either group. Age and education were related. We know that. Okay. So then our second hypothesis was about how subjective cognition would change. What we found, which I've graphed in a figure on the next slide, because it's a little easier to interpret, was that the experimental group was more likely to say that their memory had improved over the span of the study. And this was qualified here by their perceived control over their cognition. So the interaction effects make more sense when they're graphed, and this shows, this is the MI, this is the group where we told them your memory is going to get better, or that we think that this can improve your memory, and they also think that they can. Those people who have high perceived control are the dotted line that increases. So this is from day 1 to day 7. So they did think their memory was getting better. The other groups remain constant. Those slopes were not. There was no decline in those slopes or change in those slopes. So this is self-reports of cognition. The question was, there was 3 self-report items on cognition. The one that is graphed here was, compared to yesterday, how much do you think your memory has improved? So every day we asked them that, and this was their trajectory. People who have high control, who are in the memory condition. Okay, so these were our hypotheses. Everybody who's taken my foundation, I see a lot of you here. We review them at the end, right? You guys didn't think you were going to have good lectures coming here, but here we are. These were how they were supported or not supported. The memory improvement condition, we found improvements in subjective cognition, but no changes in objective cognition, which is what we expected. This improvement in subjective cognition was qualified by their perceived control of their cognition. So when we looked at that increase, it was just the people who had high control who were increasing. It wasn't everybody. And we didn't find any changes for the memory task condition. Perhaps we didn't actually use the word test, which has been what other people use to invoke the stereotype threat in older adults. We used task, so maybe there was something about the way we demonstrated it. And we weren't actually trying to test stereotype threat. We were just trying to test the brain training language. That was just our best control for that. Okay. So well, let me just, before getting to limitations. So yes, language does seem to affect people, is what we conclude from this. And it specifically affects certain people. People who think they can get better at memory, which is not a negative trait for anybody to have. But it means that some people are susceptible to the language that they hear advertised to them as part of brain training programs. So some of the limitations are our assessment of cognition. So maybe if we had assessed other objective measures of cognition, we might find some changes. However, we thought those were relevant for aging, they're relevant for the way cognition changes, and they were relevant for the brain training tasks that they practiced prior to doing the objective cognitive measures. And we had a limited time frame, so maybe if we extended beyond 7 days, we could see more. A lot of brain training programs, we do more than 7 days, so we'll see. There was a single item self-report cognition too. So that we have used in other studies, but validated longer measures of your subjective cognition might have also been a good way to measure that, but we were doing something in a daily context, so being brief was important for the validity of the study, to keep people in the study throughout the 7 days. Okay, so what are some of the take-home messages? So as I began, given the demographic changes in our country, given the state of the science in Alzheimer's disease and where we are, and the fear that seems to exist within many people about their memory, it's important to understand how people perceive brain training in society, and to perceive it in the context of potentially being on a fixed income or limited resources to pay for those services. And so, implications of this and the future work that needs to be done is working to try to understand what are the roles that regulations might play for protecting consumers. That started to be done by the lawsuit that happened from the Federal Trade Commission. But I kind of end here with a question that I think is where research should go, and what other scientists and peers in the field have said research should go, and that is understanding not is brain training good or bad, but more how can brain training fit within a systematic, comprehensive approach to cognitive health? How can it fit with the other things we have in our life, like spending time with grandchildren and hiking and spending time outside, physical activity? So that was a lot of information, and I went fast. But if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them now. Clarification, discussion questions, whatever. Thank you.
What would you think of, you have a person with some Alzheimer's who's just gone into facilitated care. We're not looking at verbal learning or anything like that. And you put them into a, Professor Flannery used a task, a wayfinding task, where it simulates the nursing home. Just a sense, do you think that kind of computerized learning may facilitate their wayfinding in the real nursing home?
So, ways to help transition people to a nursing home, is that what you're referring to? Yeah. So, there's a lot of important research that looks at the transition to nursing home and how to help facilitate that transition. And some of the conclusions are, how can we make the environment similar and familiar to what we're comfortable with? So, devices that help facilitate that, sure. And that's why I think it's important to not say, okay, brain training is good or bad. I think that's too dichotomous. It's more complicated than that. Nature of matter, right? It's more complicated than that, always. But in what ways can it be used in a safe, helpful way for people, and not in a way that's just targeting it? And that, if I'm understanding correctly, that's a way that it could be really beneficial.
Here's one other question. Some of the stuff research done at Harvard has been done a lot of looking at kids in grammar school and we put them on exercise at recess in their academic homes and cases. What if you had a different group where they engaged in a walking and aerobic thing prior to the training? Do you think that may be?
Yeah, there's research that has looked at that. So they look at just cognitive training, just physical exercise, and the combination of the two, and the combination of the two is the most beneficial. Yeah. The combination of the two is the most beneficial. Yeah, because it targets in multiple ways. So for many people, it might be cardiovascular issues or narrowed arteries that are contributing to less blood getting to the brain. So targeting in those ways might be beneficial.
So we have a family member that was recently diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and their recommendation was that this person spend more time, like 5 hours a day, socializing. First, they didn't recommend any brain training or any kind of thing like this. And I'm just curious because you mentioned, the physical activity and the correlation that has with improvements, but also the socialization, spending time with people and kind of talking versus doing something virtually where you're not usually talking to anyone, right?
Yeah, and I kind of alluded to that a little bit with the first letter that came out critiquing some of the brain training literature, that one of their criticisms is that what is the exchange of spending an hour on the computer versus an hour with your grandchildren? And that is recognizing a huge literature that suggests that social engagement, being active and that means socially active, physically active, intellectually active in a lot of ways, is one of the best things that we can do. And socializing, your doctor, obviously, their doctor knows what they're recommending, but that's recognizing a huge literature that suggests that, yes, being social is one of the best things we can do.
But it's also like, if you were, improve brain training products, wouldn't it be something that would be more interactive than just like pointing and punching, a touch screen or a computer screen?
Well, and I think that's reflected.
So many of these people are isolated; they live alone,
right? And I think that's reflected not at the other end of the spectrum in the new American Pediatric Association recommendations on screen time. they have recognized that there are some parts of screen time that might be useful, and that's FaceTiming with your grandmother, and that there are ways that maybe technology can be interactive, and that that's different than, yes, just poking your, at a game.
Getting the right answer.
And so I think that logic might apply then also to aging research, right? That there are ways that it can be interactive, unfortunately. Especially addressing rural, isolated older adults, which exists in our country.
So it sounds like some of what I'm getting from this has to do with their perceptions about themselves and their abilities to be able to improve on this.
Right.
So, you mentioned cognitive dissonance, and so it's a way of using dissonance to your advantage.
Yeah.
So it's like, you fake it till you make it, and then
Right.
you eventually believe that you can make it.
Right.
And so is one take home that what we want to do is boost people's beliefs that they have this sense of control? Because even though it's not objectively changing their cognitive abilities, the belief that it changes them might have other impact in terms of improving efficacy in other domains, improving self-esteem, maybe encouraging them and giving them that ability to then get out there and engage socially. So it might have this sort of halo effect in these other areas.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And that idea that we measured it as this kind of characteristic that people have, one way that it might benefit them is that they're likely to be kind of optimistic, right? And optimism is a great trait for across the lifespan. And that might apply to their openness to trying something like brain training, but other things as well. And I think the perspective and the point that I wanted to point out was that we're being clear in terms of what you're paying for, if you're paying for something, right? But the opposite, which some people think their memory is worse than it is, or have kind of this worried well attitude, or are depressed and don't want to try, is maybe worse than thinking it's good and maybe it's not, or thinking it's improving and maybe it's not. So that's not a bad thing, but it's really just not overselling or overstating products and being fair. And so they've kind of toned down. It still is a positive, optimistic message that might target people, but they've toned down the language to reflect that and not maybe take advantage of something. Yeah. But I think it's a careful step forward in how do we help people who are really motivated and optimistic, but not oversell things.
Well, and we as Americans, we always want the easy way out.
Yeah.
We always want the quick fix.
Right.
So, okay, I'll do it for 7 days, but I'm not going to do it for 3 months if it's going to take me 3 months to do this. Everybody wants the pill or the quick way of fixing whatever is wrong, which is why we have, in part, a weight problem in this country.
Right.
Because people don't want to make the fundamental behavioral changes that are necessary to improve their overall health.
Right. Which is probably the trade-off between establishing a routine of physical exercise, which I myself work on all the time, or try to work on all the time, versus investing an hour a day, 5 minutes a day after training. Unless we find that 10 hours, 50% reduction really works, which is the case we have a magic pill, I guess.
There you go.
A little controversial, but folks I've evaluated with Alzheimer's, particularly before it's known, they have a sense that something's not right. They have decreased affect, there's often a mild depression. When it's diagnosed, there's a withdrawal, so social stimulation is great. But it's also a market opportunity to sell them crystals and copper watches and all kinds of stuff. As you're talking about it, it strikes me that as long as you're not charging them for it, that if there's a belief in a copper watch, that intended placebo effect may have a positive gain on that low level depression.
And is it bad to do it? No, it's not going to hurt you, probably not. But it's just knowing how it fits in with other things that could be beneficial, right? Like being with your family and exercise. Yeah. You obviously have experience with that. Yeah. But it doesn't hurt you? No. Could it help you? Maybe. It's just being kind of nuanced about the extent of the advice. Other questions? Thank you for attending.